A rebellious teenager in rural Alabama kicked the altar of Our Lady during a drunken dare at the local Catholic church. At 3 a.m. that same night, he heard a woman's voice calling his name from his bedroom, but his mother was fast asleep downstairs. The September heat in Millerville, Alabama, was still oppressive even at 11 p.m. The small town of barely 1,200 souls was settling in for another quiet Saturday night, when 17-year-old Michael Thompson made the decision that would change his life forever. Michael was everything his parents, Robert and Susan Thompson, had prayed he wouldn't become. At 6 feet tall with dirty blonde hair that hung over his eyes and a permanent scowl, he was the kind of kid teachers dreaded seeing walk into their classrooms. The Thompsons were good Methodist people. Robert worked at the paper mill, Susan taught third grade at the elementary school, and they attended Millerville Methodist Church every Sunday without fail. They'd raised Michael in the faith, but somewhere around his 15th birthday, something had gone wrong. It started with skipping church, then staying out past curfew, then the drinking. By 17, Michael was the unofficial leader of a group of troublemakers who spent their weekends looking for ways to stir up drama in their sleepy Alabama town. "That boy's heading for trouble," folks would whisper when they saw Michael and his crew hanging around the Walmart parking lot or racing their beat-up trucks down Highway 31. This particular Saturday night, Michael was drunk on cheap beer and even cheaper bravado. He'd been drinking with his friends Jake Morrison and Tyler Webb behind the abandoned gas station, and the conversation had turned to the kind of stupid dares that seemed brilliant to intoxicated teenagers. "Y'all are a bunch of chickens," Michael slurred, swaying slightly as he pointed at his friends. "None of y'all got the guts to do anything really crazy." "Oh yeah," Jake shot back. "What you got in mind, Thompson?" Michael's bloodshot eyes scanned the empty street, then fixed on the Gothic spire of St. Mary's Catholic Church, barely visible in the darkness about 2 blocks away. "See that Catholic church over there?" Tyler squinted through the darkness. "Yeah, what about it? I bet none of y'all got the balls to break in there with me." St. Mary's was the only Catholic church in Millerville, built in 1952 to serve the small but growing population of Catholic families who'd moved to town to work at the paper mill. It was a modest brick building with beautiful stained glass windows and a well-maintained interior that reflected the dedication of its 80-member congregation. To most of Millerville's Protestant majority, St. Mary's was viewed with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. The Methodist and Baptist churches tolerated their Catholic neighbors, but there was an underlying tension, the kind that comes from centuries of theological disagreement and cultural misunderstanding. Michael had absorbed these attitudes growing up, but alcohol had amplified them into something uglier. "Man, that's messed up," Tyler said, his own intoxicated judgment still functioning enough to recognize a bad idea. "We can't break into a church." "It's not breaking in if the door's unlocked," Michael grinned, the kind of grin that had gotten him suspended from school 3 times in the past year. "Besides, what they gonna do? Pray for us?" Jake laughed nervously. "Dude, my mom would kill me if she found out." "Your mom ain't gonna find out," Michael said, already stumbling toward the church. "Y'all coming, or what?" Against their better judgment, fueled by alcohol and peer pressure, Jake and Tyler followed. The walk to St. Mary's took about 5 minutes, and with each step, Michael's anger seemed to grow. Maybe it was the alcohol, maybe it was the accumulated resentment of years of being told he wasn't good enough, wasn't living up to expectations, wasn't the son his parents wanted. "I'm so tired of this town," he muttered as they approached the church. "All these fake religious people acting like they're better than everybody else." When they reached the front doors of St. Mary's, Michael was surprised to find them unlocked. "See, told y'all." "Michael, man, maybe we should just go home," Tyler said, suddenly sober enough to realize the gravity of what they were about to do. "Nah, we're here now." Michael pushed open the heavy wooden doors. Let's see what all the fuss is about. The interior of St. Mary's was dimly lit by a few security lights, casting long shadows across the pews. The sanctuary was simple but beautiful. Wooden pews arranged in neat rows, stained glass windows depicting scenes from the life of Christ, and at the front, a modest altar beneath a large crucifix. But what caught Michael's attention was the side altar dedicated to Our Lady of Sorrows. The statue was about 4 feet tall, depicting Mary in her traditional blue and white robes, her hands clasped in prayer, her face bearing an expression of both sorrow and peace. Fresh flowers surrounded the statue, along with dozens of votive candles, evidence of the deep devotion the parishioners felt for the Mother of God. "Look at all this Catholic crap," Michael said, his voice echoing in the quiet sanctuary. "They really think this statue can hear them." Jake and Tyler hung back near the entrance, increasingly uncomfortable with the direction this was taking. "People actually pray to this thing," Michael continued, approaching the Marian altar. "They think a piece of stone can answer their prayers." He stood directly in front of the statue, swaying slightly from the alcohol. "What's so special about you?" he asked the statue mockingly. "If you're so powerful, why don't you do something?" The sanctuary remained silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Michael's anger, fueled by alcohol and teenage rebellion, reached a boiling point. Without warning, he drew back his right foot and kicked the base of the altar as hard as he could. The impact sent several votive candles crashing to the floor, their glass holders shattering. A small vase of flowers toppled over, spilling water across the altar cloth. The statue itself rocked dangerously but remained upright. Jake and Tyler gasped in horror. "Michael, what the hell?" Tyler shouted. But Michael wasn't done. He kicked the altar again, this time knocking over a small donation box. Coins scattered across the floor with metallic clangs that seemed deafeningly loud in the sacred space. "There!" he yelled at the statue. "Where's your miracle now? Where's your power?" He stood there panting, his face flushed with alcohol and adrenaline, waiting for something. Divine retribution, maybe. A lightning bolt. Anything. Nothing happened. "See," he said, turning to his friends with a triumphant smirk. "It's just a statue. Just stone and paint." Jake and Tyler were already backing toward the door. "We gotta go, man. Now." They fled the church, leaving behind broken glass, scattered coins, and the lingering echo of Michael's blasphemy. The 3 boys ran all the way back to the abandoned gas station, their hearts pounding from fear and adrenaline. But while Jake and Tyler were terrified of getting caught, Michael felt nothing but satisfaction. "Did y'all see that?" he laughed breathlessly. "I showed that Catholic nonsense what's what." "Dude, that was seriously messed up," Jake said, shaking his head. "That's somebody's church. That's sacred to them." "Sacred?" Michael spat. "It's a rock, Jake. A piece of carved stone. Ain't nothing sacred about it." Tyler was already calling his older brother to come pick them up. He wanted to get as far away from the scene as possible. Within an hour, Michael was back home, stumbling up to his bedroom while his parents slept soundly downstairs. He'd managed to sneak in through the back door without waking them, a skill he'd perfected over the past 2 years of increasingly rebellious behavior. As he collapsed onto his bed without bothering to change clothes, Michael felt a sense of vindication. He'd struck a blow against the hypocrisy and superstition that seemed to suffocate his small town. He'd shown those Catholics what he thought of their precious Mary. What he didn't know was that several parishioners had seen the damage the next morning when they arrived for early Massachusetts. Father O'Brien, the elderly priest who'd served St. Mary's for 15 years, had stood in front of the desecrated altar with tears in his eyes. "Who would do such a thing?" whispered Mrs. Rodriguez, one of the most devoted parishioners. Father O'Brien had simply said, "Someone who's lost, Maria. Someone who needs our prayers." But Michael knew none of this as he drifted off to sleep, still wearing his clothes and reeking of cheap beer. He slept deeply for several hours, the kind of heavy, dreamless sleep that comes after alcohol and emotional exhaustion. It was 3:17 a.m. when he heard the voice. Michael. The voice was soft, feminine, and seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It woke him instantly, his heart pounding as he sat up in bed. "Michael, my son." This time there was no mistaking it. Someone was in his room, speaking his name with a voice full of sadness and love. Michael fumbled for his bedside lamp, his hands shaking as he switched it on. The room was empty, but the voice seemed to linger in the air like an echo. "Hello," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Who's there?" Silence. Michael got up and checked his closet, under his bed, everywhere someone could hide. Nothing. He crept to his door and listened for sounds from downstairs. His parents' bedroom was directly below his, and he could hear his father's familiar snoring. But the voice had been real. He was certain of it. He sat back down on his bed, trying to rationalize what had happened. Alcohol-induced hallucination, maybe. Or a dream so vivid it seemed real. But even as he tried to convince himself, he knew better. The voice had been as clear as if someone had been standing right next to him. "Michael." There it was again. Clearer this time, more insistent. He looked around frantically, but the room remained empty. Yet the presence felt overwhelming, not threatening, but impossibly sad. "What do you want?" he whispered into the darkness. "Why did you hurt me?" The question hit him like a physical blow. The voice was filled with such pain, such maternal sorrow, that Michael felt tears spring to his eyes without understanding why. I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, even though he knew exactly what she meant. "My altar, Michael. My flowers. My children's prayers." Michael's blood ran cold. There was no way anyone could know what he'd done. Jake and Tyler wouldn't tell, they were just as guilty as he was. "You kicked my altar," the voice continued, and now Michael could hear tears in it. "You broke the gifts my children gave me. You mocked their faith. You're not real," Michael said desperately. "This isn't happening. I am as real as the love I have for you, my son. I'm not your son. You are all my sons. You are all my children. Even when you hurt me, even when you reject me, you are still mine." Michael was crying now, though he couldn't understand why. The sadness in the voice was overwhelming, like a grief so profound it filled the entire room. "Why are you here?" he whispered. "Because you're lost, Michael. Because you're hurting. Because the anger you carry is poisoning your heart. I'm not lost. I know exactly what I'm doing. Do you? Is this who you want to be? Someone who destroys what others hold sacred? Someone who brings pain instead of peace?" Michael wanted to argue, wanted to maintain his defiance, but the words wouldn't come. In the presence of this voice, this overwhelming maternal love mixed with profound sorrow, his anger seemed to crumble. "I don't know how to stop," he admitted, the words coming out as barely a whisper. "You start by asking for forgiveness. You start by choosing love instead of anger." "Forgiveness from who?" "From you. From me. From the people you hurt tonight. From yourself." Michael sat in silence for several minutes. The presence remained, patient and loving, waiting for his response. "How do I know you're real?" he finally asked. "Look in your heart, Michael. You'll know." And somehow, impossibly, he did know. This wasn't a hallucination or a dream. This was something beyond his understanding, something that made him question everything he thought he knew about faith, about God, about the statue he'd kicked just hours earlier. What do I do now? Rest tonight. Tomorrow, you make things right. How? You'll know when the time comes. The presence began to fade, but before it disappeared completely, the voice spoke one more time. Remember, Michael, you are loved, even in your anger. Especially in your anger. And then she was gone, leaving Michael alone in his room with the echo of words that would change his life forever. He didn't sleep for the rest of the night. He sat on his bed, staring out his window at the darkness, thinking about what had happened and what it meant. By the time the sun rose over Millaville, Alabama, Michael Thompson was no longer the same angry, rebellious teenager who had kicked the altar of Our Lady of Sorrows. He was someone who had heard the voice of divine love, and who could never again pretend that faith was just superstition. The question now was, what was he going to do about it? The next morning came too soon and not soon enough. Michael had spent the hours between 3 a.m. and sunrise sitting by his window, replaying every word of the conversation that had turned his world upside down. When his mother called him for breakfast at 8 a.m., her voice seemed to come from another universe, a normal world where teenage boys worried about homework and weekend plans, not divine visitations in the middle of the night. Michael. Breakfast. Susan Thompson called up the stairs, her voice carrying the familiar mix of love and exasperation that had characterized their interactions for the past 2 years. Michael looked at himself in the mirror. He looked terrible, hollow-eyed, pale, still wearing yesterday's clothes. But something in his eyes was different. The constant anger that had lived there for months seemed to have been replaced by something else. Confusion, maybe, or the beginning of understanding. "I'll be right down, Mom," he called back, surprised by how normal his voice sounded. The kitchen smelled like bacon and coffee, the same as every Sunday morning for as long as Michael could remember. His father sat at the small table reading the Birmingham news, while his mother moved efficiently between the stove and the counter, preparing what she still optimistically called family breakfast, despite the fact that family conversation had become increasingly strained. "Morning, son," Robert Thompson said without looking up from his paper. "You were out pretty late last night." Michael froze with his hand on the refrigerator door. Had they heard him come in? Did they know? "Not too late," he said carefully, pulling out the orange juice. "Jake Morrison's mother called about an hour ago," Susan said, flipping bacon in the pan. "Apparently he came home pretty upset about something. She wanted to know if you boys had gotten into some kind of trouble." Michael's blood turned to ice. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I'd talk to you." Susan turned to face her son, studying his face with the practiced eye of someone who'd been dealing with teenage deception for 2 years. "So let's talk. What happened last night?" Michael sat down heavily at the table, his mind racing. How much did Mrs. Morrison know? What had Jake told her? "We just hung out. You know. Talked." Robert folded his newspaper and fixed Michael with a stern look. "Son, your mother and I weren't born yesterday. You've got that look, the same one you had when you got suspended for fighting with Danny Peterson. Look, nothing happened, okay? Can we just eat breakfast?" But Susan wasn't letting it go. She turned off the stove and sat down across from Michael, her teacher instincts fully activated. "Michael Thomas Thompson," she said, using his full name the way she did when she meant business. "I've been your mother for 17 years. I know when you're lying, and I know when you're in trouble. Now what happened last night?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Michael stared at his untouched plate, feeling the weight of his parents' expectations pressing down on him. For 2 years, he'd been disappointing them. For 2 years, every conversation had been about what he'd done wrong, who he'd been hanging around with, why his grades were slipping. He was tired of being the family disappointment. But now, in the light of what had happened at 3 a.m., lying seemed impossible. "We went to the Catholic Church," he said quietly. Robert and Susan exchanged glances. "St. Mary's?" Susan asked. "Why? We were drunk. It was stupid. We thought it would be funny too." He stopped, unable to find words that would make sense of what he'd done. "To what, Michael?" Robert's voice had gotten dangerously quiet. "I kicked their altar. The one with the Mary statue. I broke some stuff." The silence that followed was deafening. Michael could hear his father's breathing, his mother's sharp intake of breath, the tick of the kitchen clock that suddenly seemed loud as a drum. "You did what?" Susan's voice was barely a whisper. "I kicked it. I was mad and drunk, and I did it." Robert stood up so fast his chair nearly toppled over. "Michael, do you have any idea what you've done? That's not just vandalism, that's desecration of a place of worship." "I know," Michael said miserably. "I know it was wrong. Wrong." Susan's voice cracked. "Michael, this is beyond wrong. This is horrible. Those people at St. Mary's, they're our neighbors. They're good people. And you attacked something sacred to them." Michael looked up at his parents, really looked at them, and saw something he'd been too angry to notice before. They weren't just disappointed in him. They were heartbroken. "Why?" Susan asked, tears starting to form in her eyes. "Why would you do something like this?" It was the question he'd been asking himself all night. Why had he done it? Anger, yes. Alcohol, certainly. But underneath it all, something deeper and uglier. "I don't know," he said, and for the first time in months, he was telling his parents the complete truth. "I don't know why I did it. I was just angry." "Angry at what?" Robert demanded. "At everything. At this stupid town, at church, at people pretending to be perfect when they're not, at you guys always being disappointed in me." The words came out in a rush, months of accumulated resentment finally finding voice. "We're disappointed because you keep making terrible choices." Robert shot back. "Because you're throwing your life away." "Robert," Susan said quietly, putting a hand on her husband's arm. "Let him talk." Michael looked at his mother, really looked at her, and saw not the nagging authority figure he'd been resenting, but a woman who'd spent 2 years watching her son self-destruct and not knowing how to help. "Mom," he said softly, "something happened last night." "What do you mean?" Michael took a deep breath. What he was about to say would sound crazy. They'd probably think he was having some kind of breakdown. But after everything that had happened, he couldn't keep lying. "After I got home, around 3 in the morning, I heard a voice. A woman's voice. She was talking to me." Robert and Susan exchanged worried glances. "What kind of voice?" Susan asked carefully, in the tone she used with students who were clearly upset. She said her name was, well, she didn't say her name exactly. "But I think it was Mary. The Virgin Mary. The one from the statue." "Michael," Robert said gently, "you'd been drinking. Sometimes alcohol can cause hallucinations." "It wasn't a hallucination, Dad. She was there. In my room. I could feel her presence." "What did she say?" Susan asked, her voice soft with concern. "She asked me why I hurt her. She said I was lost, that I was carrying anger that was poisoning my heart. And she said I was still her son, even after what I did." Michael's voice broke on the last words. The memory of that overwhelming maternal love, offered freely despite his actions, was almost too much to bear. Susan reached across the table and took his hand. "Oh, honey. I know it sounds crazy," Michael continued. "I know you probably think I'm losing it. But Mom, it was real. More real than anything I've ever experienced." Robert sat back down, his anger replaced by confusion and concern. "Michael, I don't understand what's happening here." "Neither do I, Dad. But I know I have to make it right. I have to go back to that church and apologize." "You certainly do," Susan said firmly. "But Michael, vandalism is a crime. You could be arrested." "I know. But I have to do it anyway." They sat in silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Robert spoke up. "You said you think it was the Virgin Mary talking to you?" "I know how it sounds, Dad. Son, we're Methodist. We don't pray to Mary the way Catholics do." "I know. But she came to me anyway." Susan squeezed his hand. "What do you want to do?" "I want to go to that church this morning. I want to apologize to their priest and offer to pay for whatever I broke. And I want to apologize to her. To the statue? To Mary. However that works." Robert rubbed his forehead, trying to process everything his son had just told him. "Michael, I have to ask, are you sure this wasn't just guilt making you imagine things?" Michael met his father's eyes directly. "Dad, for the past 2 years, I haven't felt guilty about anything. I've been proud of being rebellious, proud of not caring what anyone thought. But last night, when I heard her voice, it was like someone turned on a light in a room I didn't even know was dark." 20 minutes later, the Thompson family was driving through the quiet streets of Millaville toward St. Mary's Catholic Church. It was 9:30 a.m. on a Sunday morning, which meant the congregation would be arriving for 10 a.m. Mass. Michael sat in the back seat, his stomach churning with anxiety. What if Father O'Brien called the police? What if the parishioners were angry? What if last night really had been a hallucination brought on by guilt and alcohol? But as they pulled into the church parking lot, Michael saw something that strengthened his resolve. Several parishioners were gathered around the side entrance, the one that led to the Lady Chapel where he'd done his damage. They were carrying flowers, cleaning supplies, and what looked like replacement candles. "They're already trying to fix what I broke," he said quietly. Susan turned around to look at him. "It's not too late to change your mind, honey. We could talk to Father O'Brien privately, arrange to pay for damages without." "No, Mom. I need to do this right." They got out of the car and walked toward the church. Several parishioners noticed them approaching. The Thompsons were known in town, even if they weren't Catholic. Word traveled fast in a community of 1,200 people. Mrs. Rodriguez, whom Michael recognized from her job at the post office, approached them with a curious but friendly expression. "Morning, Susan," she said to Michael's mother. "Y'all here for Mass?" "Actually," Susan said, glancing nervously at Michael, "my son has something he needs to discuss with Father O'Brien." At that moment, the priest himself emerged from the side entrance. Father O'Brien was in his 70s, with white hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. When he saw the Thompsons, he smiled warmly. "Robert, Susan, good to see you. And young Michael, what brings you folks to St. Mary's this morning?" Michael's mouth went dry. This was it, the moment of truth. "Father O'Brien," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to confess something to you." The priest's expression became more serious, but remained kind. "Of course, son. What's on your mind? Last night, I broke into your church. I was drunk and angry, and I kicked the altar in your lady chapel. I broke candles and knocked over flowers and scattered coins around. I desecrated your sacred space. The small crowd of parishioners that had gathered went completely silent. Father O'Brien studied Michael's face for a long moment. I see, he said quietly. And what brings you here this morning to tell me this? Michael glanced at his parents, then back at the priest. Because Mary came to me last night. The Virgin Mary. She spoke to me, and she told me I needed to make things right. A murmur went through the crowd. Mrs. Rodriguez made the sign of the cross. Father O'Brien nodded slowly. And what did Our Lady say to you, Michael? She asked me why I hurt her. She told me I was lost, that anger was poisoning my heart. But she also said, I was still her son, even after what I'd done. Tears were running down Michael's face now, but he didn't care. Father, I don't understand what happened to me last night. I don't understand how this is possible. But I know I need to apologize, and I need to make restitution for what I did. Father O'Brien was quiet for a moment, then reached out and placed a gentle hand on Michael's shoulder. Son, he said softly, Our Lady has been known to speak to those who need her most. Even, especially, to those who think they don't want to hear from her. Do you believe me? I believe that Mary loves all her children, Michael. Even the angry ones. Even the lost ones. Sometimes, especially the lost ones. Mrs. Rodriguez stepped forward. Father, I was here early this morning when we found the damage. I have to say, whoever did it seemed to be in great pain. Other parishioners began to nod and murmur agreement. We've been praying for whoever did this, said an elderly man Michael didn't recognize. We prayed that their heart would be healed. Michael looked around at these people whose sacred space he'd violated, whose religious devotions he'd mocked, and saw not anger, but compassion. I have money saved up, he said to Father O'Brien. I can pay for whatever I broke. That's not necessary, son. But there is something you could do for us. Anything. Would you be willing to help us clean up and repair the Lady Chapel? Not as punishment, but as a way of participating in healing. Michael nodded eagerly. Yes, sir. Absolutely. Father O'Brien smiled. Then let's go see what needs to be done. As they walked toward the church entrance, Mrs. Rodriguez fell into step beside Michael. You know, she said quietly, my grandmother always said that Our Lady has a special love for young people who are struggling. She said Mary remembers what it was like to be afraid, to not understand what God was asking of her. Really? Really? She was just a teenager herself when the angel came to her. Probably not much older than you. Inside the Lady Chapel, Michael saw the damage he'd done with fresh eyes. Broken glass had been swept up, but the altar cloth was still stained with flower water. Several candles needed to be replaced, and the small donation box was dented. But what struck him most was the statue itself. Our Lady of Sorrows stood exactly as she had the night before, serene, compassionate, her hands folded in prayer. It was as if she'd been waiting patiently for him to return. I'm sorry, he whispered to the statue, feeling slightly foolish but compelled to speak. I'm sorry I hurt you. I'm sorry I was so angry. As he spoke, he felt something he'd never experienced before, a sense of being forgiven, not just by the statue or by God, but by something deeper and more personal. A mother's forgiveness. For the next 2 hours, Michael worked alongside the parishioners of St. Mary's to restore the Lady Chapel. He learned their names, heard their stories, and began to understand what their faith meant to them. Mrs. Rodriguez told him about praying to Mary during her husband's cancer treatment. Mr. Castellanos shared how he'd asked for Our Lady's intercession when his son was deployed to Afghanistan. A young mother named Jennifer explained how she came to the Lady Chapel every week to pray for her autistic son. As he listened, Michael began to understand that what he'd attacked wasn't just a statue. It was the focal point of real people's hopes, fears, and deepest prayers. "I never understood," he told Father O'Brien as they replaced the last of the broken candles. "I thought it was just superstition." "Faith can look like superstition to those who haven't experienced it," the priest replied kindly. "But once you've heard that voice, once you've felt that presence, it changes everything, doesn't it?" Michael nodded. "Father, what do I do now? I mean, I'm still Methodist. My family's Methodist. But after last night..." "You don't have to become Catholic, Michael. Mary is the mother of all Christians, not just Catholics. What matters is that you've opened your heart to her love." "But how do I live with this? How do I go back to normal life knowing what I know now?" Father O'Brien smiled. "You don't go back, son. You go forward. You let this experience change you. You become the man Mary sees when she looks at you. Not the angry boy who kicked her altar, but the beloved son who heard her voice and chose to respond." As they finished cleaning, Mass time was approaching. Father O'Brien asked Michael if he'd like to stay. "I don't know the prayers or anything," Michael said hesitantly. "That's okay. Just sit and listen. See if you hear her voice again." Michael looked at his parents, who had been quietly helping with the cleanup. His father nodded. "We'll stay with you, son," Robert said. So the Thompson family attended their first Catholic Mass, sitting in the back pew of St. Mary's while Father O'Brien celebrated the Eucharist. Michael didn't understand all the rituals, didn't know when to stand or kneel, but he felt a deep sense of peace. During the homily, Father O'Brien spoke about second chances and the power of forgiveness. He didn't mention Michael by name, but several times their eyes met across the sanctuary. After Mass, numerous parishioners approached the Thompsons to welcome them and express gratitude for Michael's honesty and willingness to make amends. "You're always welcome here," Mrs. Rodriguez told them as they prepared to leave. As they walked back to their car, Michael felt lighter than he had in years. The anger that had been his constant companion seemed to have lifted, replaced by something that felt like hope. "So," Susan said as they drove home, "what happens now?" "I don't know, Mom. But I know I'm different. I know I can't go back to being who I was." "What about Jake and Tyler?" Michael had been thinking about his friends all morning. "I need to talk to them. They need to know what happened. Maybe they need to hear her voice too." That evening, Michael called Jake and Tyler and asked them to meet him at the old gas station. When they arrived, they found a very different person than the angry, rebellious leader they'd followed the night before. "Guys," he said, "I need to tell you what happened after we left the church." He told them everything: the voice, the conversation, the morning at St. Mary's, the forgiveness he'd received from people he'd wronged. Jake and Tyler listened in stunned silence. "Dude," Tyler said finally, "are you serious right now?" "Dead serious. And guys, I think we need to go back. Together. I think you need to apologize too." "Michael, I don't know about all this religious stuff." "It's not about religion, Jake. It's about doing the right thing. It's about healing instead of hurting." It took 3 more conversations, but eventually Jake and Tyler agreed to accompany Michael back to St. Mary's. They met with Father O'Brien privately, confessed their role in the vandalism, and asked for forgiveness. Father O'Brien welcomed them with the same compassion he'd shown Michael, and all three boys ended up volunteering to help with church maintenance for the rest of the summer. By senior year, Michael Thompson had become a different person entirely. His grades improved dramatically, he stopped drinking, and he developed a reputation as someone you could count on for help. He never converted to Catholicism, continuing to attend Millerville Methodist with his family. But he also maintained a special devotion to Mary, often stopping by St. Mary's Lady Chapel to pray when he was troubled or grateful. She speaks to anyone who's willing to listen, he would tell people who asked about his transformation. You just have to be ready to hear. The night he graduated valedictorian of his high school class, Michael stopped by the Lady Chapel one more time. "Thank you," he whispered to the statue that had somehow become a source of comfort and guidance. "Thank you for not giving up on me." As he knelt there in the quiet chapel, he could swear he heard, very faintly, a familiar voice. "I never give up on my children, Michael. Never." Today, Michael Thompson is a social worker in Birmingham, specializing in at-risk youth. His office wall features a small replica of Our Lady of Sorrows, not as an object of worship, but as a reminder of the power of maternal love to transform even the angriest heart. And sometimes, when he's working with a particularly difficult teenager, he tells them about the night he kicked an altar and heard the voice of divine love calling him home. Because some people need to know that no matter how far they've fallen, no matter how much damage they've done, there's always a mother's voice calling them back to love. And there you have it. This incredible story of divine intervention and maternal love touched your heart, didn't it? Michael proved that even when we rebel against the Virgin Mary in our anger, her maternal love never gives up on calling us home, right? If you were moved by this real testimony of how a rebellious teenager kicked Our Lady's altar in a drunken rage and then heard her voice at 3 a.m. calling him back to love and forgiveness, hit that like button below. It really helps me continue sharing these stories that show Mary's unconditional love for all her children. If you're not subscribed yet, subscribe now and hit that notification bell. Every week there's a new testimony that will renew your faith that the Virgin Mary never abandons her children, especially the rebellious ones who need her most. And don't forget to check out our store in the first pinned comment. We have amazing Christian products, including the 365-day devotional, perfect for strengthening your relationship with Jesus and understanding Mary's maternal love. Tell us in the comments. Have you ever rebelled against faith in your youth? Do you believe the Virgin Mary speaks to troubled teens? And if you also believe in Mary's never-ending maternal love, write, "Mary never gives up," declare your faith in her persistent love. Share this video with parents of struggling teens, with young people who've lost their way, with anyone who needs to know that no matter how far we fall, there's always a mother's voice calling us back to love. Thanks for watching until the end. May the Virgin Mary bless your life and help you hear her voice of love calling you home. See you in the next testimony.